If you want to share your screen, I gave permission to you. Okay, we can clearly see your presentation right now.
Okay, thank you. Can I start now?
Sure, ma'am. You may
Yes,
start.
thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Afnan Ganayem. I'm a PhD student at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom. Today I will present my thesis work. My thesis title is The Impact of Political Instability on Economic Performance for the case of the Middle East and North Africa. The outline of the presentation today will be start from introduction and discuss the research aims and contribution. After that, I will discuss my data and sources, methodology, and the result and discussion. First of all, this study considers two economic performance indicators. It is separately test the impact of political instability on inflation volatility and the impact of political instability on economic growth. The MENA region is considered in this study because from 2010 ongoing until now, the MENA region considered as the hottest region in the world because it experiences various political instabilities such as civil wars, government crises, and military coups, and so on. This research aimed to test two hypotheses. The first one, the null hypothesis for the first one assumes that political instability has no impact on inflation volatility, while the alternative one assumes that there is a statistically significant impact of political instability on inflation volatility. The second hypothesis, the null hypothesis here assumes that the political instability has no impact on economic growth, while the alternative one assumes that there is a statistically significant impact of political instability on economic growth. Research contribution. This study has four main contributions. First one is this study is the first study that examines the effect of political instability on inflation volatility for the context of the MENA region. In the literature, there are just two studies that tested this relationship. One for them was for the context of Africa, and the other, I think, consider about 130 countries, not included MENA region. The second contribution is this study is the first study that uses a wide range of political instability indicators in studying the impact of political instability on inflation volatility. This study will use 19 political instability indicators and will cover all the political instabilities events that affect the sample, the countries. The first two studies, one of them used just two political instabilities, and the second one used around four political instability indicators. Also, this study measures inflation volatility as the conditional variance of inflation level. It's applying by applying Garch, e-Garch, and t-Garch model for each country, then choosing the best model for each country. Finally, this study is the first study that assesses the impact of political instability on economic growth for the MENA region by using all events that generate uncertainties and challenges of the political system and government. And this study includes the Arab Spring instability events from 2010. Data and sources, as I mentioned, 19 political instability indicators were collected from Integrated Network for Societal Conflict Research and Data Bank International Cross-National Time Series Data Archive. Economic data include inflation rate, GDP growth, and economic control variables were collected from International Financial Statistics and the World Bank. Due to the data availability, the sample will consider 14 MENA region and will cover 13 years. from 13 years, yes, from 2006 until 2018. Methodology, this study adopts three methods. First one is method to measure inflation volatility, which are GARCH, e-GARCH, and t-GARCH models, and the factor analysis model to measure the political instability measurements, to measure the political instability indicators, and generalized method of moment to test the impact of political instability on inflation volatility and on economic growth. First result for inflation volatility measurement, as I said, I applied GARCH, e-GARCH, and t-GARCH for each country's time series inflation data. Then, based on the model with the lowest Akaika information criterion, the best method for each country has been chosen. I found that t-GARCH is the most prevalent model. It is the best fitted model for 7 countries. e-GARCH is the best fitted model for 5 countries, and GARCH was the best fitted model for just 2 countries. For political instability measurement, I used factor analysis technique. I used 19 political instability indicators here, and I found 5 political instability dimension: instability of political regime, war, government instability, aggression 1, and aggression 2. So the panel data was built from the factor scores I found here, the 5 dimensions, the scores of the 5 dimensions, and also the conditional variance that obtained from GARCH and e-GARCH and t-GARCH, then analyzed by GMM approach. Sorry. Here, the result of the impact of political instability on inflation volatility. I have found that regime instability have a positive and significant impact on inflation volatility, which means increasing in regime instabilities will increase inflation volatility, and that means it's harm the economic performance. While the government instability has negative and significant impact on inflation volatility, which means government instability dimension is good for economic performance. While for the result of the impact of political instability on economic growth, I found the same political instability dimension have the same impact for both studies. Here, regime instability has negative and significant impact on economic growth, which means increasing in regime instabilities will decrease economic growth significantly. On the other hand, government instability has positive and significant impact on economic growth, which means government instability enhancing economic growth significantly. To conclude, I have found two political instability dimensions have significant impact on economic performance. The first one, instability of political regime dimension, includes successful coups, riots, and number of major constitutional changes, reported a negative impact on economic growth and significant positive on inflation volatility, which mean as I expected, instability of political regime dimension reduce economic growth and increase inflation volatility. That means decrease economic performance. On the other hand, government instability dimension includes number of major cabinet changes in effective, executive, and number of elections, reported a positive impact on economic growth and negative effect on inflation volatility, which mean increasing in these political instability indicators leads to enhance the economic performance. Thank you for listening. Any question?
Thank you for your presentation. We may get questions and contribution right now. And also we may get it during the other presentations. Just you need to write it on a chat site. or raise your hand. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we will continue with Yon Won Kim from Singapore. Yon Won Kim will present us the mechanism of climate change policy diffusion among local governments in South Korea. Young Won, thank you for joining us. I give my word to you now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let me share my screen.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, now we see your presentation clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Hello, everyone. Today, I'm gonna talk about how and why the certain policy diffuses from one government to other governments based on South Korean empirical data about climate change policy. Okay. Okay. Globally, under the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol, most of the climate change regimes have been driven by the national government. And the role of the local governments has been downplayed because many people think local governments do not have enough incentive to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and rather they may want to be free riders. However, surprisingly, the efforts of local governments to tackle climate change has significantly increased during 2000s. Then, how was Korean cities? Although South Korea does not have any binding responsibility to reduce greenhouse gas emissions under the UNFCCC and Kyoto Protocol regime, a sharp increase in greenhouse gas emissions due to the rapid economic growth made South Korea face international pressure for CO2 mitigation. So Korean national government has established various climate change policies, and many local governments have adopted and implemented several policies since late 2000s. So far, South Korean local government's climate change policy adoption has been explained by the reason that the pressure of central government. The particular example was that after President Lee Myung-bak declared low carbon green growth as a new national vision in 2008, the central government forced local governments to join the efforts for green growth. But my question is that, was it only because of the central government's pressure? If it was, how we can explain this phenomena? First, some local governments have already adopted climate change policies before Low Carbon Green Growth Act. And second, local governments made different responses to the central government policy. Third, local governments are still adopting climate change policies even after the low carbon green growth vision has been weakened due to the change of government in 2013. With this background, my research question is, despite negative expectation of local governments' commitment to tackle climate change, why does the number of local governments adopting climate change policy increase? In fact, many researchers addressed this problem, but due to the diverse and sometimes contradictory results of those studies, there is no consensus as to why local governments establish climate change policies. So I expect that answering this question will contribute to both theory development and practical implications. Many studies provide various factors to have correlation with climate change policy adoption of local governments. They are basically divided into two factors, internal factors and external factors. Internal factor model include problem severity, like high vulnerability and extreme temperature. Also, economic factors such as financial condition of local governments and economic benefits of greenhouse gas emissions reduction. Also, they include political factors such as role of policy entrepreneurs, pressure of citizens, and political inclination. Also, they point out external factors like transmunicipal networks and influence of other governments. Particularly, we call this process that one government's policymaking is influenced by other governments as policy diffusion. The policy diffusion among governments can be considered in two levels. One is vertical diffusion between upper government and lower government, and the other is horizontal diffusion among the same level governments. For vertical diffusion, the most common mechanism is coercion from the upper government. Upper governments often force the lower governments to follow their policy through mandates, and also they can induce the lower government's compliance by offering financial incentives such as subsidy, which has indirect coercive power. For horizontal diffusion, learning, competition, and imitation are typical mechanisms. Learning is a process where policymakers change their beliefs about the effects of policies by achieving information about the causation between policy and certain outcomes based on the experience of other governments. By contrast, policymakers sometimes just copy of other governments' policy without evaluation of policy outcomes because they have social, economic, or cultural similarity, or because they sometimes believe that the policies of advanced countries or cities will be better than their own policy. We call this mechanism imitation or emulation. Finally, competition occurs when a government reacts to other governments in order to attract or to retain their resources. The typical example is race to the bottom in welfare policy and environmental policy. So based on the review on these theories and previous studies, I set up the hypothesis to be tested like this. The major difference of my hypothesis from other studies is that unlike common perception that climate change adoption of Korean local governments highly depends on central government's political will, I tried to argue that horizontal diffusion mechanisms and internal conditions might work for local governments to adopt climate change policy as well as vertical diffusion mechanism. For empirical analysis, I selected 5 representative ordinances based on these serial steps. So finally, selected ordinances are Ordinance on Response to Climate Change, Ordinance on Low Carbon Green Growth, Ordinance on Energy, Ordinance on Support for Green Building Construction, and Ordinance on Promotion of Use of Bicycles. These ordinances comprise of 2 comprehensive ordinances for tackling climate change, and 3 ordinances which are the most common ordinances respectively in energy, building, and transportation sector. For empirical models, the 5 panel data sets including 227 local governments were used. Each data set includes data from the year when the ordinance was adopted for the first time at the basic local government level to 2017. And the specific models for the panel regression and event history analysis are like these. The dependent variable is adoption of ordinance, and independent variables consist of proxies for vertical diffusion mechanism, horizontal diffusion mechanism, problem severity, economic factor, and political factors. So specific proxy variables and their measurement are presented in this table. Proxy variables for diffusion mechanisms have been selected based on the previous studies meta-analysis, and all independent variables are lagged variables of T-1. So, okay, then let me briefly explain the main results. I prepared some slides for each ordinance having the same format. The first slide includes brief description of the initiation and diffusion status of the ordinance and the figures showing diffusion of the ordinance by year and region. The second slide is empirical analysis result, but let me skip explanation about these 2 slides because of time constraints. Instead, empirical results as a whole will be presented later of this presentation. Just look at these figures, then you will find that some geographical clustering of policy adoption, diffusion of the ordinance based on the geographical proximity. So this is ordinance on response to climate change, and this is ordinance on low carbon green growth. And this is ordinance on energy. So yeah, it's kind of apparent that geographical clustering of the policy diffusion. And this is ordinance of the purple green building. Also, you can find some geographical clustering. And this is ordinance on promotion of use of bicycles. So it's the same as with the other ordinances like the geographical division. Okay, here are the key results from empirical analysis. The tables from this slide summarize significant correlation between various factors and the adoption of each ordinances. I will describe these results with reviewing minutes and script of local assembly in order to provide more fruitful interpretation of this result. For vertical division, coercion from the central government partly affected the adoption of local climate change policies. In most cases, national law and adoption of local ordinances do not show statistically significant correlation. But one thing to note is the interpretation of negative correlation between them shown in ordinance on low carbon green growth. Numerous local governments adopted the ordinance in the same year that the national law was enacted. So in this case, the effect of national law can be reversed in the model, including lagged variables, and consequently, it may be interpreted as evidence supporting the strong influence of the central government, even though the coefficient presents some negative values. This is supported by minutes of many local assemblies. After Low Carbon Green Growth Act were established, the ministry sent a sample of standardized ordinance to regional governments, and the regional governments urged local governments to their own ordinance based on the sample ordinance. According to the act, establishing the ordinance is mandatory for regional governments, but not for basic local governments. Nonetheless, the central government put pressures to local governments by designating the establishment of the ordinance by the end of 2010 as an evaluation criterion for local governments. The same thing happened between regional government and basic local governments in the case of bicycle ordinance. For example, Seoul Metropolitan Government induced all of 25 basic local governments to establish the ordinance. It requested the local government's cooperation by sending out sample ordinance to them and designated the adoption of the ordinance as a preferential condition for financial incentives. One of the most prominent mechanisms found from the empirical analysis is that a local government is more likely to adopt an ordinance if other local governments in the same region adopt the ordinance. I assume this phenomenon was originated from the competition mechanism of local governments. Indeed, the minutes of several local assemblies revealed that the local governments had the intention to preempt subsidies with other local governments. In addition, local governments comparatively adopted the ordinance in order to improve their status and reputation. One of the most frequent questions coming up during the deliberations of legislation was how many local governments under the same regional government had adopted the ordinance. For learning mechanisms, the empirical analysis shows that the increase in the number of local governments receiving awards in the climate change area and acclaim membership may increase the probability that a local government adopts an ordinance. In the minutes of local assemblies, there was no direct mention of acclaim membership or awards of other local governments, but the local governments receiving awards for climate change policies were often referred to as benchmarking targets. For example, in many local governments, bicycle paths and public bicycle system in Changwon, France, Japan, and Northern Europe has been mentioned during the deliberations of the ordinance, and it has been emphasized to implement well-tailored policies for their jurisdictions based on learning from those cases. On the other hand, imitating policies of neighboring governments is statistically insignificant in most ordinances. For internal factors, the empirical analysis shows that the effects of problem severity and economic factors on the adoption of ordinance over local government are not clear. However, political factors have relatively stronger correlation with the adoption of ordinance. In particular, it needs to pay attention to the leadership of mayor that has been mentioned as a key factor in many previous studies. The minutes of assembly and annual administration speech of a mayor confirmed that the willingness of the mayor also had a positive effect on the adoption of climate change policies in some local governments in South Korea. For instance, Songpa-gu and Nowon-gu in Seoul became front-runners in climate change and renewable energy policy with the strong will and passion of the head of gu. So in conclusion, the key message of this analysis is that unlike common perception, vertical coercion does not always work in climate change policy division process in South Korea. Coercion works actively only if the upper government imposes mandates or offer financial incentives to them. Otherwise, they may not show immediate response to the new policies of upper governments. Rather, horizontal division based on the competition for subsidy and reputation among local governments and internal factors, particularly strong will of the mayor, work together. These findings can provide implications for enhancing participation of local governments in climate change actions for the future. First, financial incentives need to be used to induce vertical coercion and horizontal competition for local governments to actively participate in the climate change actors. Second, best practices should be identified and shared among local governments in order for learning mechanism to work well. Finally, the roles of policy entrepreneurs in public sector are important. It needs to encourage leaders in public sector, including mayors, local assemblymen, and government officials to be more interested in climate change. So thank you for listening, and then all the questions and comments are welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your presentation. It was a nice one in terms of how climate change impacts on cities, and also actually there are lots of projects all around the world, but yours are really good implications, policy implications. Thank you very much for that. If there are any questions or contribution regarding to both presentations, we may take it. While we are waiting for the questions and contributions, actually we have an issue with Dr. Asri Saleh, who will present his study for the next session. He has an issue for the internet connection, so he just recorded his video, and I will get it for that, and I will how can I say, I will publish it on behalf of you right now. Thank you very much. I'm just okay. Yes, I'm saying probably I'm opening it.
My name is Saleh from UITM Malaysia Sabah branch. Today I'll be presenting on Kimanis by-election, the role of the candidate, missionary and current issues on to the election results. So the objective is, just like the title suggests, is to examine the strengths and weaknesses of the political parties and the candidates in terms of the current issues, the missionaries and the candidates. Basically, we wanted to see to what extent current issues, missionaries and the candidates or the candidacy affected, influence the chances of those political parties running the Kimanis by-election. So we went to Kimanis for about, we spent about 2 weeks, 1 week prior to election day and a week after. And during the fieldwork, we held key information interviews and held a number of focus discussions with the local voters as well as the local communities. Now, just a little bit of information, background information for some of you. Some of us who might have no idea about the election system in Malaysia. So in a nutshell, in sum, in Malaysia we have about 222 parliamentary constituencies, and each one of these parliamentary constituency has 2 or 3 state constituencies under. Now, political parties with the most numbers of parliamentary constituencies won in a given election will go on to form the federal government. Likewise, political parties with the majority seats of states seats will go on to form the state government. Now, election system in Malaysia is based on single member constituency. That means there will be only one representative representing a constituency, either parliamentary or state. And the voting system applied here is first past the post, not proportional representation as some other democratic countries. But now Malaysia held its 14th general election at 14th time in 2018. In Kimanis parliamentary constituency, what makes this constituency special is that it was the constituency of Malaysia's former foreign minister, Hanif Rahman. Hanif Rahman was the Kimanis representative for 4 terms coming into this by-election. He was the parliamentary representative for 4 terms in a row. 2004, 2018, 2013, and 2019. Now, in 2018, Hanifa, for the first time running for this parliamentary seat, he won the election, and he got 11,142 votes, as opposed to Karim, who managed to get 11,796 votes. The third candidate was an independent candidate, Jafar Ismail, secured only 1,300 votes. So as you can see, the difference of the votes, the numbers of votes between Karim and Hanifa were very slim. In fact, Hanifa won with a very slim majority of only 156 votes. Now, if we go back in time, Hanifa was used to winning Kimanis seat handsomely. In 2004, he won with a 5,000 majority, likewise 2018, and likewise in 2013. But suddenly, in 2018, he won only with 156 votes. So, considering this record, considering these numbers of votes, so Karim thought that he had a genuine case, and he filed for election petition with the special court of election, and took about 18 months, and eventually the special election court decided in favor of Karim, cancelling the election results in 2018 on the ground of technical discrepancies, which, as admitted by election commission itself, was caused by the EC, not by any one of the candidates. So the technical discrepancies were caused by the election commission itself. Now, acknowledging that, Hanifa refused to recontest, to run the by-election, and also the fact that he left UMNO 5 months after the G14 also put him into a complicated situation. So eventually he decided not to run the by-election, and UMNO in his place put forward Muhammad Alamin, while Warisan, owing to the fact that Karim was the one who filed the petition, stayed with him. There was no independent candidate this time around. For your information as well, Warisan was the state government of today, while its partner in the federal level, Pakatan Harapan or PH, was the sitting federal government. As you might have all known as well, 2018 was the first time that Barisan Nasional was removed from power. Barisan Nasional until that time had been the federal government since 1957, since independence. So 2018 was a remarkable year, and eventually it was it suffered a defeat, and PH came into space by forming a new federal government. Now, as far as the findings are concerned, both of this Muhammad Alamin and Karim was actually, they shared one thing in common. Both had served as the state representative of Bengawan constituency. Like I said just now, each parliamentary constituency has 2 or 3 state constituencies under. So Bengawan is one of the 2 state constituencies under Kimanis. So now Muhammad and Karim were former representatives for Bengawan. Now the difference between these two was that Karim represented Bengawan for more than 5 terms, more than 20 years. And in fact, Karim was defeated by Muhammad Alamin in 2000 and in the state election 2013. But Muhammad went on to suffer a defeat in state election 2018, also by a Warisan candidate going by the name of Dr. Yusuf. By this time, Karim, after he suffered the defeat in 2013, went on to one level higher by contested the parliamentary seat. Now, all the 3, Hanif Rahman, Muhammad Alamin, and Karim, were all former members, were and are members of UMNO. So since 2018, like I said just now, Hanifa went on to become independent. Karim went on to join Warisan, and Muhammad Alamin is still a member of UMNO. Now, speaking of these 2, Muhammad and Karim, like I said, Karim, since he had this record of serving for Bengawan for more than 20 years, we found that the local communities had a lot of things to talk about him. While Muhammad, on the other hand, we found that the local communities had very little to talk about him, except from the fact that he was defeated by a new local boy, also from Bengawan, Dr. Yusuf. So now, these records of these service records in sum turn out to be an advantage for Muhammad Alamin, because since the local communities had very little to talk about him, most of the things that the people remember about Karim were the bad things that he left behind. Actually, to put this thing in a nutshell, Karim left behind a negative or a bad legacy behind. So the moment the local communities, the local voters saw that Karim wanted to run again for the parliamentary constituency, you could see that there was a widespread frustration among the local communities, even among the Warisan's missionaries themselves. So some of them said that they were actually disappointed with the decision made by the Warisan's hierarchy. But like I said just now, also Warisan had to fill in Karim because he was the one who spent lots of resources and money filing in the election petition and eventually won it. So Warisan owe it to Karim for persistently going after the petition and eventually won it. So now here, in summary, the service record of these two candidates eventually turned out to be both advantages and disadvantages. And in this case, it turned out to be an advantage for Muhammad, because he had a lot of things to talk about Karim. And Karim, on the other hand, had little things to talk about Muhammad, because Muhammad managed to serve only for about 4 years. Now, as far as the current issues were concerned, Warisan at that time, going into the by-election, had to defend lots of things. In fact, Warisan had to be on the defensive. UMNO, on the other hand, turned on to be on the offensive, because Warisan, 2 years going into this by-election, had lots of things to answer. Some of which, with regard to its manifestos, which remain unfulfilled until that time. And I think the most controversial issue at that time was the Warisan's plan to introduce what we call Sabah Temporary Pass, STP. Sabah Temporary Pass was actually meant to register the illegal immigrants in Malaysia, and it was supposed to be the first step in holistic action to put the illegals under control. And also it was also supposed to be an exercise to eventually to get the exact numbers of the immigrants in Sabah. But in Sabah, every time you speak about the immigrants, it would always turn to be, or it would always lead to something negative. It is not to say that the Sabahans were anti-immigrants. No, they were actually anti-illegals, illegal immigrants. For your information also, going by the data provided by the government, there were almost 1 million illegal immigrants in Sabah alone. And most of them came from the Philippines, who fled to Sabah during the civil wars in Mindanao in the 70s and 80s, and the remaining illegal immigrants came from Indonesia as well. So the total numbers of these illegals were estimated to be in a range of 1 million. Now the total population of Sabah alone was only 3.2 million. So that is why always it is a very controversial issue when every time the political party speaks about the illegal immigrants. So any attempt to what we call to legitimize the illegal immigrants' presence in Malaysia will surely be a bad omen for the political parties. But Warisan had to do something at that time. Warisan thought that they were doing the right thing, because they wanted to put an end to this issue, never-ending issue of the illegal immigrants. And the first step, the correct step towards that objective is to get their numbers, their total numbers. But this proposition by Warisan was met by a huge rejection by the local communities, as well as the other communities in Sabah. And this proposition also played a very important role in encouraging the other opposition political parties to join forces with UMNO. And this brings us to the third finding. Now, as far as nationality was concerned, since UMNO was the stronghold of UMNO, and the fact that the other opposition political parties joined forces with UMNO, it helped UMNO's machinery to double its resources, to double its strength to double its reach as opposed to Warisans. And now this unified coalition eventually, its machinery eventually managed to dwarf that of Warisan. And on the election day, UMNO won with a majority of 2,029 votes, not not even half of what Hanifa used to win, but it was enough to keep the Humanist parliamentary constituency under UMNO at this time, of course, under Muhammad Alami. Warisan, so in this by-election, UMNO managed to get 12,706 votes, while Warisan managed to get 10,677 votes. But these numbers are actually one should consider as flattering for Warisan. But from our point of view, we believe that Warisan, because of its position as the sitting state government, so that also contributed to its managing to get these numbers of votes, which was quite huge. Now for the conclusion, so we can conclude here that Warisan suffered badly from the candidacy, from choice, from candidates with a long bad legacy, and wrong timing of the current issues, especially the proposition to introduce Sabah's temporary pass, wrong timing. And then the last one, in terms of the missionary, Warisan's missionary failed to match the missionaries of the unified opposition political parties. And collectively, these three contributed to the victory of UMNO and the defeat of Warisan. I think that will be all from me. Thank you.
I would like to thank you, Mr. Asıl Saleh, for his presentation. Sorry for that. I'm stopping it. Perfect. It's an advertisement, by the way. I would like to thank you all participants to this session. And now I will take a break for like 15 minutes. And right after 15 minutes, we will meet at 6 p.m. For the next session. I would like to thank you all for their valuable presentations, ma'am. I'm right now stopping the recording.